watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
This is a session devoted to a new history of New York City Jews called City of Promises. And we have assembled 4 of the 5 participants in this enormous project. This is a conference that is focused on beyond boundaries, and in some ways these volumes attempt to do just that. That is, they have the grounding in historical research on American Jews, but they also move beyond those boundaries to think about New York Jews through the lens of art history. I think that we're really fortunate to have assembled such an incredible team with very different perspectives, and yet who all work together to do that. I'm going to start with our questions, and I think I want to begin with just a very broad one that asks each of you to reflect on some of the challenges that you faced in your particular cases, in terms of your volumes, in terms of the essay. In other words, how does one write a history of New York City Jews? This is, as I mentioned last night, a settlement of Jews whose population exceeds, certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, the populations of many Western European countries. It's a huge project. How do you get a handle on the complexities and find a path through the history of New York City Jews?
For our period, 1840 to 1920, which covers the main period of mass immigration, both from Central and Eastern Europe, dividing our period into 2, I think the challenges really were that for the latter part of that period, the Eastern European phase, there's tremendous amounts written. Of course, that makes it in some ways easier, but we're up against a lot of competition, like World of Our Fathers, like The Promised City. So the challenge was to find a new way of saying some of the same things, because they needed to be said in a volume like this, and finding some new things to say. I think in the earlier part of the period, though, there's really not that much written. There are some general volumes on Jews in the United States. There are some volumes on German Jews in the United States. But there is really not that much about Jews in New York that really situates Jews in the life of the city, which is something we were trying to do. I mentioned one more thing, which is that I don't know if it counts as 1 or 2 of the lacunae that Deborah mentioned. I think one which probably still remains is that there's really very little secondary material about Jews outside of Manhattan for this period. And by 1920, actually by 1917 or 18, when the Jewish Communal Register came out, there were something like 500,000 Jews in Brooklyn. And this is something that I don't know if I was surprised, I probably should have known it, but I was a little bit surprised that almost as many Jews in Brooklyn as there were in Manhattan. But almost all of the histories really with tiny exception of here and there a little bit on Brownsville, really focus on Manhattan. And we tried to integrate Brooklyn and also the Bronx. Bronx really develops a little bit later, but still by the World War I, Jewish Bronx was starting to arise. We tried to integrate this a little bit, but I think it's still an area which there could be a lot more research about. Of course, once you get to the 1920s, you have books like Deborah's book and Beth Wanger's book in the 1930s, the Jews of Brooklyn book, which has, once you get to the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of secondary accounts and primary accounts, but really for this early period, there's very little.
I agree with everything Daniel said.
Good.
Another thing I would add to it, just from a slightly different perspective, is about this element of there's no way we could write the history of New York Jews that would make every single person happy. And so really seeing that kind of that fervor and excitement for New York City is at the same time exciting and an opportunity, but on the other hand was a bit of a challenge because I think it is daunting, especially in the beginning, to kind of undertake this project and say, you know, I've lived in New York for 16 years, but I'm from Milwaukee. So it's just the kind of how do you become confident enough to write this history, know that you can't do everything, but still be able to weave in particular angles. And I think that's one of the things we took as an opportunity, not to try to be as comprehensive as possible, but also with each chapter to kind of create a kind of essay style and hone in on that.
The biggest challenge was I had no model. And my training is as an art historian, an American historian. I do work on some American Jewish artists, but I'm not a Jewish studies scholar. So I had to backtrack and get my feet in a lot of the literature, then go into the art history literature. It's exciting not to have a model to work with. It's a little like bungee jumping without the cords being tested. You'll be testing the cords. But it gave me a lot of freedom to explore and see what was out there. And of course, my primary source is an object, then I go to the social history, then I go back to the object. And I may have had great fantasies of things that I would love to have reproduced, but the objects don't exist anymore. So I can't. So I have to stay with what we've been managed to hold on to over the years.
So I'm very intrigued by what Dan and Annie said about the challenges of historiography. In a sense, my volume, the challenge of my volume is the opposite chronologically from theirs, and that is for my early period, which is 1922, 1941, there is abundant literature, and Dan referenced Deborah's work and Beth's work. I would also mention Ron Bayor's work, which people don't always reference enough, Neighbors in Conflict, where there is an existing very fine literature on the subject. So my challenge was to interrogate what my colleagues did, question what they did, but more importantly, try to give an additional nuance to the story of neighborhood life in the interwar period. Later on, I'll talk about the challenges of doing the post-war period and the contemporary period. But let me just focus for just a few moments about the interwar period. Everyone talks about the character of Jewish neighborhoods, Williamsburg being an Orthodox neighborhood, or so it's said, Borough Park, Zionist, the Bronx being working class radical, and that is certainly true, but I was looking for something a little bit more nuanced, and that is, within these neighborhoods that have these characters, you have different diverse types of Jews. There are some Jews, whether they're Orthodox or Zionists or radicals, and they differ ideologically, very much they want to change the world. And yet there's a mass of Jews who want to live prosaic lives, simple lives, happy lives, prosperous lives in these neighborhoods. And I wanted to get at not only the ideological leaders, but the rank and file. And with your permission, I'm going to give you one example from the work, and that is the experience of Jewish men and women at the City University during the interwar period. Everyone talks about City College as being 90% Jewish, 85% Jewish. Steve Brunberg can give you the right numbers on that, okay, being predominantly Jewish. It's also known as a hotbed of radicalism. There's no question about that. And people have written so much about the famous alcoves in the cafeteria of City College and about the New York Jewish intellectuals who were just students then. They became New York Jewish intellectuals after the fact. And every book, so much has been written about them. Every book talks about their experience, and there's always a footnote that says, by the way, they were 1% of the student body. You know, we talked today about 1% versus 99%. Well, this applies to it as well. So I became very interested not only in the articulate leaders, but the 99% of people who may have shared some of the visions of the world that these radicals and these activists, very important in my book, activists had, but were holding 3 or 4 jobs while they were going to City College, who listened to the alcove lectures and then moved on. I just want to share with you a quick memoir by A.M. Rosenthal, who was a student at City College, who said, when I graduated DeWitt Clinton High School, it was either City College or the post office, and I chose City College. And then I found a memoir, because I looked at Beth Wenger's book, where she found a memoir of Louis Weiser, who was a City College graduate who ended up going to the police department. And he said, I graduated from City College, and then I went into the civil service. So I started thinking, what is the life experience of these people who are trying to live a life during the Great Depression? And the same thing applies to women, by the way. Although a minority of women go to college, we have the memoir of Lucy Davidowitz, Lucy Schildkraut, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who's involved at Hunter College. She's part of the Young Communist League. And she complains in her memoir about the 18 sororities at Hunter College, the Sing activity, the senior hop activity. So I'm saying to myself, and this informs the rest of the work, that when you look at New York Jewish history, these are diverse stories. Different voices are constantly heard, and it applies to this period, and perhaps later on I'll talk about how it applies to the later period as well. Oh, one last thing. Here's a bit of a trivia question with great implications. City College, hotbed of radicalism, had the largest ROTC contingent in the entire country before the Second World War, made up of Jews. And I looked to where these Jews lived. They lived in the same neighborhood as Irving Howe, and the same neighborhood as Daniel Bell. Different voices, different visions, different understandings of what it means to be a Jew at the iconic Cheder on the Hill called City College.
All right, well, thank you. So you're hearing now some of these challenges. I want to ask you another question that's related to it, which is to say, what surprised you? As you were doing this work, and you all had familiarity with with New York Jewish history, perhaps there were things that you discovered that you hadn't expected. And if so, what did this surprise reveal that was new about the history of New York City Jews? And maybe this time we'll start with Jeff. Okay, we'll go the other direction.
I'd like to take you inside for a moment some of the research that I did and the surprise that became apparent to me and was very important. One of my short periods is 1941 to 1945, asking the question, not about Roosevelt and the Jews of Roosevelt, but what are the average men and women, the rank and file of Jews, doing in the city of New York during this important, colossal time for the city, for the country, and for Jews. And I did some archival work, and I found an archive of a local synagogue in the East Bronx, which helped produce my dialect, and immersed in the documentation about that particular synagogue was a document, an annual report from the National Council of Young Israel, a modern Orthodox synagogue association. And in that document, there is a speech, there's the text of a speech given by the president of the Young Israel, a lay leader, in which he's criticizing the 1943 Orthodox rabbis' march on Washington, D.C. Now, within the historiography of American Jews and the Holocaust, when people talk about disunity and these types of concerns, very often people talk about, and yet those rabbis marched on Washington, and they confronted the White House, and they confronted Congress, and there was a certain unity within the Orthodox community. And lo and behold, J. David Delman delivers a speech to the National Conference, which could, I'm sorry, I somehow misplaced the text of his speech, but you'll buy the book and you'll read it, okay? Where he sounds like Stephen Wise. He says, why I revere these rabbis, but wouldn't it have been better if 4 or 5 very important Jews would show up and get an audience with the president, the vice president. The president has so many other things to worry about. Why are they marching on Washington? Yes, it's a time of turmoil and crisis for our people, but perhaps things should be done in a quieter, more respectable way. It's a shocking document in a way because it indicates that the story that Wise and his cohorts are the establishment and outsiders have a different vision, everything has to be nuanced. Nothing is very simple. So I didn't look for it, but it came into my hands, and I consider it to be a very interesting finding. And finally, about the archive itself, I looked to see whether anybody was ever informed on a local basis that there's a Bergson rally, that there's a Wise rally in Madison Square Garden, and how are they reacting? Perhaps we'll talk about that later. Thank you.
One of the challenges was that there was a ton of material, 1880 onward, but before that, a lot of the works had focused on Central European Jews throughout the nation, not specifically rooted in New York. And so one of the things I was so excited to find, and I have to thank Susan Malbin here, the archivist at the American Jewish Historical Society, who actually had come to meet me and some of my colleagues for lunch on Orchard Street and happened to mention, oh, we found this great list, a matzah distribution list from 1858. And what I loved about this is that you had the lists of people's names, they had the wives' names, their addresses, and it really brought to life for me, the way in which this area that we talk about as the Jewish Lower East Side was, of course, Klein-Deutschland, and a significant kind of subset of that population was this German Jewish population that was adapting in much the same ways that German Lutherans and German Catholics were, but of course they had distinct needs. And it was, what I did with this is then I took this material and took the addresses and compared it to the city directory in the 1860 census, and was then able to kind of get a sense of how these Central European Jews were settling in these neighborhoods, and found that the primary areas, and this is actually illustrated outside in the exhibit and the map, is that you can see that they were huddled mostly in Klein-Deutschland, around Attorney Street, Willett Street, Houston Street, and then another set on Mulberry Street, Mott Street, Canal Street, so part of 5 Points. And this was perfect because what Danny and I had wanted to do too was show how immigrant Jews were part of a broader immigrant New York, and that their adaptation in many ways was played out in relationship to the ways that others were adapting. And so it was really, and this was really neat too, because one of the great books of the early New York history is Hyman Grinstein's The Jews of, The Rise of the Jewish Community of New York, that goes up until 1860. And it's a wonderful book in many ways. Lots of sources, and the appendices are especially rich. I think Beth Wenger has called it magisterial, and I agree with that. But I was able, his kind of concept of geography and the map that he has doesn't refer to 5 Points or Klein-Deutschland. He calls these neighborhoods East Midtown or Lower Midtown, or these terms I've never heard of. And so it was great to kind of get this and be able to then resituate these Jewish immigrants as part of these other immigrant working class lives. What it also did was we're able to kind of show the ways in which, despite all the fracturing, the divisiveness that was happening with regard to congregations, as congregations kept dividing, as new people came and formed new congregations, and there was a split. And so by 1860, you have 27 synagogues, in which 1825 there was only one, or two by 1825. Despite all these divisions among congregations, you're able to get all these congregations to unite in order to distribute matzah. So it was also a way to see the ways in which charity becomes a way for the New York Jews, even those who've moved, and especially those who've moved uptown to other neighborhoods, to reconnect to the working class Jews that were such a dominant part of New York life.
This is the distribution, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, yeah. Danny?
Well, one of the things that, the areas that I enjoyed researching, although a lot of it was in secondary material, a lot of the material itself is not that new, was the rise of Jewish politics in New York. In the 19th century, there were certainly many individual Jews who were involved in New York politics. Some of them were identified as Jews, like Mordechai Emanuel Noah. whose walking stick we have in the exhibit outside. But they did not, this didn't mean that they were representing Jewish constituencies. This didn't mean that there was a Jewish community presence in the politics of New York. But by the end of the 19th century, there was, and it was growing in the early 20th century. So again, as Annie said, one thing we wanted to do was to situate New York Jews very, very squarely in the city itself, and to not write about them as if they existed in a vacuum, which is sometimes a problem. I think not only when writing about Jews in New York, but even writing about Jews, let's say, in the Shtetl or in Eastern Europe. So we wanted to show how they were interacting with other people, and politics was one area which that was possible to do. So we wrote about the conflicting pulls on Jews in politics in New York, one of which was, of course, Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in Manhattan in particular. But there were also Jews in the Republican Party and reform movements, and especially, of course, in the Socialist Party in New York. And what we tried to show is that there were Jews drawn to all of these areas, but there were limits in this period to how far Jewish influence could go. So, for example, in Tammany, many Jews were involved in Tammany, but Tammany was so dominated by Irish Catholics that there was a kind of what we call an emerald ceiling for Jews in Tammany. George Washington Plunkett, the famous Tammany author of what's his book called? Plunkett of Tammany Hall, thank you, which many people read as undergraduates, even says at one point, the Jews love to be governed by the Irish. And the interesting thing, of course, in Tammany Hall was that the power was not in the public offices. The power was in the district leaderships, in the party machinery. So by 1900, Tammany is recognizing the importance of a Jewish constituency, and they're nominating people Jews for public office, like Henry Goldfogel, who became congressman from the Lower East Side. Now again, there were Jewish congressmen from New York before that, but they were individuals who happened to represent certain districts. Goldfogel was the first one put forward by Tammany as a Jewish candidate for a Jewish district, and put forward as the quintessential son of the Jewish people, as I think Stephen Wise said at his funeral later on. But these Jews who got involved in Tammany adopted the Tammany style. There was a Tammany style of gregariousness, of generosity. There was a certain kind of moral code. There was an honest man was someone who, if he promised you a kickback, he gave you the kickback, He didn't go back on his word. So one observer talking about Jews who got involved in Tammany Hall said this. He said, the Russian Jewish young man, generally a lawyer, who casts his fortunes with Tammany Hall, gradually assumes the habits of his Tammany confreres. He chews, smokes, drinks, gambles, visits the club rooms religiously, attends the politico-social functions of the year, is prominent in the purchase of chowder tickets, and is rewarded perhaps by being permitted to play at the Tammany Chowder game of poker with the elite of the district. As a rule, these young Russian men who make their way into Tammany Hall belong to the lower order. In some cases, the office holders are taken from the most colorless class, having nothing but regularity and party fealty as their redeeming features. The one thing I would disagree with is that they were colorless. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but they were very colorful. One of the most colorful and one of the few Tammany district leaders was Martin Engel, the kosher chicken czar, described as stolid and squat and physically unattractive. He had been, Tammany kind of guy, had been in too many barroom brawls, and his nose was flattened. His face was smashed beyond all recognition, according to the New York Times. And New York Times, you have to believe. So he had plastic surgery, which must have been interesting in circa 1900. And that later sued his plastic surgeon because his nose did not come out Hebraic enough. Because he was a kosher meat seller, he wanted to show that he was Jewish. But the real imprint I think that Jews made on New York was through the socialist movement and social reform movements. There, the same observer says that the most remarkable of all, or the socialists, as a rule, the socialist leaders are students whose collegiate course has been prematurely cut off by reasons of migrations caused by anti-Semitism or economic distress. They are powerful debaters and excellent journalists. And the socialists put forward these really high-class kind of individuals for public office. They were a dynamic force, and although they were not, it wasn't particularly a Jewish form of politics either, and there were Germans who they learned a lot in the movement from, and there were non-Jews. It was in the Jewish districts that socialism became a force. But in this period, even socialism was limited, right? Because they could not break out of their Jewish electoral ghetto. And so the real Jewish power had to come for a later period.
Okay, so I want to move on and ask you, in a sense, one of the big questions, which is to say, what do you want readers to take away from the volumes and the essays that you've done? I mentioned, the theme of this year's conference is Beyond Boundaries. How does your volume, your essays in the City of Promises project go, as it were, beyond boundaries?
On the left is an etrog. It had started its first life as a mustard pot. The idea of syncretic objects. You may do, even if you're high class, you may do with what you had. You couldn't get a whole new one commissioned, so you took the mustard pot and rearranged it a little bit and used it for a ritual function. So I feel in some ways that from the minute Jews started making objects in the US, they were different from what was in Europe because the materials were different, the object makers were different, the context in which they used them might have been different, and instead of a large Dutch synagogue, it was a little more kind of cabin-like atmosphere. So this idea of syncretic objects, not assimilated, not acculturated, but both Jewish and uniquely American, as one thing I'd like you to come away with. The pendant on the right, I'm Jennifer Hammer from NYU Press, who said to me, find fun things in jewelry is fun for me, fun things. This is assimilation at its maximum. This is a mourning pendant. All of the golden thread that look like wheat, those are locks of hair of the two boys who had died. The golden ground is their hair crushed up, and it's painted on white ivory. So the adaptation of high style became much more quickly than folk culture. Folk culture stayed true to its roots. High style, high culture, there was a quicker absorption of other traditions. It's always an art historian's wish that you look at the book, close the book, and then go see the real object. And the importance of visual objects in dialogue with historians, but even more so that these things, objects are historical events that continue to exist in the present day, and that you go and examine them and build your own visual relationship with them.
Takeaway. As I mentioned in my first remarks, I think my story is a story of diversity and complexity of the New York experience in the 20th century into the 21st century. To begin with, I have a 5-borough challenge. My colleagues constantly chided me, at what point will you discuss Staten Island? But I was able to bring them into the story in the contemporary period, where there's a migration of Jews from Brooklyn and elsewhere to Staten Island. So if you are Staten Islanders, you're also in the book. But I want to make a more important point, I think, that's relevant for us as American Jewish historians. I often kibitz with medievalist friends of mine that when they give a lecture, no one ever gets up in the audience and says, I heard Maimonides say the following, and what you're saying is not what Maimonides said. And I'm taken by what Annie said about being a native-born Milwaukeean living in New York for 17 years. I've been in this city for over 60 years. And one of the challenges for me, and I indicated this in this hall a month ago, was that for the period of the 1950s and 1960s, I'm studying my own personal story. Now, one should not go too far and take one's own experience as being emblematic of what's going on. But one of the things I want to look at is to what extent my experience as a New York Jew is replicated by other Jews, is different from other Jews in a variety of contexts. And I want to give one example. One of the turning point moments in African American and Jewish history in New York City, as many of you know, is the teachers' strike of the late 1960s. And so much has been written about it. And often the Jewish story is the story of Albert Shanker and the United Federation of Teachers. And there's no question that's a major part of the story. That interested me. It also interested me that there were Jewish teachers, many of them younger, many of them men, for a reason that I'll mention in a moment, who did not agree with Shanker. Why I'm mentioning men? Because some of them are there because it was a legitimate out from the draft in the Vietnam War, and that brought men, and many of them had a stronger sense of universalism than the more parochial United Federations of Teachers. Additionally, there was a teachers' union before the United Federations of Teachers, which was made up of people on the left. And some of them were exorcised during the McCarthy era, and some of them were still around during that time period. And some of them may have been the women at Hunter College who were sympathetic towards Lucy Davidowitz, but who didn't want to go to a protest because they didn't want to get on the blacklist if they hoped to be a public school teacher. Look at the story. It's very, very complex. And perhaps an African-American historian would talk about the complexity within the African-American community. And finally, as I have indicated in a variety of places already, in terms of the impact of race, New York City, when I was growing up, was a very segregated town. I lived in a working-class neighborhood which was segregated. And we didn't know any African-Americans, and we were untouched by the emerging crisis. So, my story is not the only story, it's one story, and you take your own story and you nuance it by looking at the larger tableau of this experience. So I think diversity and complexity is something that I hope to indicate neighborhood by neighborhood, place by place over the course of 90 years.
One of the things, even though I'm from Milwaukee, one of the things I had to do very early on is start going on the street, giving walking tours to people who were native-born New Yorkers, and I had to prove my worth doing that, so I had to make sure I read up and knew what I was talking about. But also, one of the things that allowed me to do is observe what was the collective knowledge that people had of the past. And of course, one of the things that was very strong in people's mind, especially when we went to the Education Alliance or something like that, was how the German Jews, the uptown Jews, how different they were from the downtown Jews, and how the snobbishness of them. And so one of the things that was really nice was to kind of work from Ahazia Diner's work, especially in talking about how, of course, when these Central European Jews arrived, they were poor, they were peddlers, they worked themselves. They worked their way up slowly, and in many ways, the story of an East European Jew arriving in 1880 is not that different from a Central European Jew arriving in 1860. So one of the things that was really important for us to do in the volume was talk about how over the period that we're talking about, the majority of Jews in New York were working class. And so what did that mean to be a working class New Yorker, not just an immigrant New Yorker, but a working class New Yorker? And of course, that ties into our other goal of connecting the story of Jewish immigrants to the broad other immigrant groups in New York and native New Yorkers. And then to that point too, even those who by the end of the 19th century were well established and middle class, as many were, the ways in which their Jewish identity in many ways came from the relationship they had towards the working class Jews, creating charity organizations, creating the Educational Alliance. Even all the synagogues had sisterhoods that were sent down into the neighborhood. So the relationship between uptown and downtown, I think we complicate a lot by focusing a lot on the working class. To that point, we might be criticized for not doing enough about our crowd. And then another thing, a little bit different, is working from what Diana just said about she wants her readers to then go out and go view the object or go view the the photograph. I think one of the things we tried to do, and were successful in some chapters and maybe less in others, was to talk about space and to talk about buildings and the built environment of New York City. So what I would want is someone to read the book and go out and go look at these buildings. And just one example of the way that we did that, and how I think also it changed the way we viewed, for me, in writing and having to use space and working from space and the built environment, it changed the way then I could approach the historiography. So with regard to religion, a lot of the work that was done in New York Jews and religion has to do with denominations and the Reform movement and the emergence of the Orthodox movement and Reform and the conflict between them. What I did instead was look at the Moorish style of architecture that became very important right after the Civil War. And New York was not the first city to have a Moorish synagogue. That was Cincinnati with B'nai Yeshurun and Isaac Mayer Wise, and then there's a Moorish-style synagogue in San Francisco. But Temple Emmanuel in 1868 becomes the first Moorish synagogue in New York. It received a ton of attention, and it was so different from all the other religious structures that were built. So there's this interesting thing that even as these congregations are adapting to America, adapting to New York, they're building a really distinctive style of architecture, which makes them stand out completely, literally, through the skyline. But the next Moorish synagogue in New York was Sha'arei Tefillah, which was an Orthodox congregation that was using the Moorish style. And the next was Ahavat Chesed, which becomes Central Synagogue. And then soon after you have Eldridge Street, downtown, an Orthodox synagogue. So all of these synagogues are using Moorish synagogue, a Moorish style of architecture. And what we talked about was the way in which this is showing an engagement with America, not just a movement towards reform, and then was able to show how reform and Orthodox are, regardless of where they position themselves along the spectrum, they're all an experiment in trying to figure out how to adapt their Jewish congregational life to America. So using buildings and space was something we tried to do throughout in various ways, and I think it helped us write about the material in a different way, and that became especially important as we moved later on, and there was so much material to deal with, using the space and the built environment as an anchor to do that. So I guess my wish would be that you would read this and then say, oh, she didn't do enough with this, he didn't do enough with this, and write your own histories and prove us, and do the buildings that challenge that.
But Moorish Manhattan is a great chapter in the book. Yeah, yeah.
I think Jeff said complexity and diversity, and I think Deborah said enormity or enormity. So diversity, complexity, enormity, and I would say also pervasiveness, that readers of the books just see how New York City became so infused with Jewish influence in this period, without falling into the trap of Jewish contributions. And this is another challenge to say, well, you know, this guy was a Jew, this was a Jew, and this was a Jew, but to really see that there was a real engagement of Jews with just about everything going on in the city. And this goes well beyond things that were officially and specifically Jewish or aimed at Jews, so that they were involved, for example, in German language culture in the 19th century in a big way, not just as performers and as writers, but as audiences, and an important part of the German theatrical audience, for example, a German theater in the 19th century, in culture that was aimed specifically at Jews, in Jewish languages like Yiddish, and then of course in the 20th century, much more in American popular culture in the English language as well. So without just pointing out which ones are Jewish and how important they were, to show that there was this interaction of Jews with a whole variety of cultures in New York, in all different languages, and how these cultures also influenced each other. That German people involved in the German theater went on to be important in the English language theater and the Yiddish theater, and influencing the English theater, and vice versa, and so on. So I guess I would like people to think about what that means for New York and for the Jews, but also maybe for other groups as well.
My question is maybe, it might have like a halachic answer, or it might have a demographic, social scientific answer, but I think it does present a historiographic problem, and I'm wondering if it was dealt with individually or across the board, and it's age-old, right? Who is a New York Jew?
One of the things we did for the exhibit that's outside is asked 5 New Yorkers today or 6 New Yorkers, what is a New York Jew? And they all had completely different things to say. So one thing, though, I'll say is to go back to the 1850s, one of the things that was important for me to show was the way in which you didn't have to be part of a congregation to be considered a New York Jew. So even when you are flagrantly breaking Jewish law by opening your store on Saturday, for example, you are considered a Jew. And the way that I showed that was a debate that was in the Asmonean in 1854, where a professor, Emanuel Brandeis, had gone to the Covenant Hall on Orchard Street, which was the hall for the B'nai B'rith, and had given a talk about how disgraceful it was for Jewish storekeepers to be open, to be selling on Sunday. And I had to keep reading it over again. I'm like, he means Saturday. But no, he meant on Sunday because they're desecrating a public day of worship. He didn't say anything about the storekeepers who are open on Saturday. He's talking about on Sunday because that makes us look bad. And what it shows you is that even as you break the law, right, you are Jewish law, you are still very much considered part of the community. And so that one thing that was very important for us to do early on is to show that religious identity, formal, I should say, religious identity did not mean that, was not synonymous with New York Jew.
Yeah, so this gets into what Annie was just saying and also what Jeff was saying before, which is that it was very important to get beyond official Jewish activities or even strong Jewish identification. So I would say that to the extent it came up, we cast a wide demographic, or halachic net, and anyone who was considered themselves a Jew, was considered by other people a Jew, was embedded in Jewish social networks, or came out of a Jewish family, can be considered in some way a Jew, and can figure in the story if it seems relevant.
And to quote Daniel Soyer, one of the chapter 5, one of the promises of New York was the freedom not to associate with other Jews as well, and I think that.
And perhaps the freedom not to associate with other Jews in a formal relationship, but in an informal relationship is emblematic. I think if there's a common theme among the 3 volumes and the essay is that we have Jews walking the streets of New York and imbibing Jewishness by being there, as opposed to Soyer to being involved in religious or cultural or radical organizations. And I agree with Dan about what I would call wide open tent in terms of definition of who gets into the volume. But I want to say 2 other things. One is that in a way there's a New York state of mind, and one of the things that I took from Deborah's work on the migration of Jews to Los Angeles is that you have New York Jews who move to LA and they open New York-style delicatessens. They establish alumni associations from the old side, namely the Grand Concourse, or my alma mater, City College, has an alumni association in LA. So they maintain their New York orientation even though they're 3,000 miles away. And one final point. Let me take you into a bit of a difficulty or controversy, always on the side of the angels. It's always business, not personal, among us. And that was a question that was raised about my volume, about looking at the 1970s, 1980s, who's more emblematic of New York Jewry, Woody Allen or the Lubavitcher Rebbe? And to my way of thinking, it all depends on how you're telling the story, what is important. So in my volume, both of them appear. And the question is, how do you put them into the story, and what is their larger significance in terms of the New York Jewish narrative and the New York narrative? So it's a very good question, and I think we all grappled with it, each in our own way.
The equation of New York and Jewishness, I think that equation really arises during the period that Annie and I talk about, right? It's sometime between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century where people, both Jewish and not Jewish, both in New York and outside of New York, begin to associate New York City as a whole with Jews, and also certain neighborhoods and streets and industries and so on with Jews. One of the most interesting things that we have in the book is an illustration of it's an anti-Semitic cartoon, actually, of Jewish used clothes sellers on Chatham Street in the year 1850s. And what's interesting to me about that is that, and it's from one of the big Leslie's, or one of these big national English language magazines. And what's interesting to me is that here is probably one of the earliest manifestations of people looking at a certain part of New York, at least, if not the whole city, and equating it with a certain kind of Jew. In this case, negatively, but it doesn't have to be negatively.
And that's accompanied, too, by all sorts of quotes from travel guides of people describing the activity on Chatham Street and what the business motivations of the Jewish immigrants that were settling there in a negative light.
Yeah, and then later on we talk a little bit about culture, Jews' involvement in the production of popular culture and art, and of course that leads directly to Hollywood. And as Jeff was saying, you know, Hollywood really was a colony of Jewish New York in a lot of ways. New York itself lost its preeminence in the movie industry by 1920, but the people who were carrying these things out in Hollywood were New York Jews or immigrant Jews who passed through New York, and they played a very important role in spreading this image and in spreading things like Yiddish slang. And you think of the Marx Brothers, hooray for Captain Spaulding, the African explorer, did someone call me Schnorr? And they were actually of German origin, but nevertheless they were from New York, from Brooklyn.
Let me just start with talking about perceptions of New York Jews by other people. So not only are New York Jews seen as a type of individual by the outside world, but other Jews elsewhere in the country feel that way. I'm struck by the fact that one of our colleagues, Marianne Sanua, did an interesting article about how Jewish students who didn't go to City College or NYU, who ended up going to places like University of Alabama, University of Georgia, Tulane in its early days, were perceived by other Jews as having a distinctive characteristic that they were seen as radicals or poor, or a combination thereof, and there was some internal disagreement and concern on the part of these local Jewish communities in the South that, hey, the New York Jews are coming, and undermining our privileged and comfortable status within the city. One other thing I want to say about the significance. From my way of thinking, in dealing with the socialist impact, there is an interesting dichotomy, and that is, it may be said that the socialists may have ruled the streets, both on the Lower East Side and elsewhere, but they had great difficulty gaining election, and in many instances had to trim their sails because of alternate narratives within the Jewish community on what does it mean to vote for a socialist. So I'm suggesting is people may have assented to their teachings, but when it came to the ballot box, perhaps it was more appropriate for them to take the chicken, perhaps even the kosher chicken that Tammany Hall had to offer.
Yeah, I don't know if I hope I didn't say that the Socialist Party was the most important. I don't know did I say that? I said it was the Jews' most particular contribution. And it became important because it combined with a social reform ethos outside of this narrow socialist movement, and combined with some elements of and always in coalition with non-Jews through the Democratic Party, people like Al Smith and Robert Wagner and so on. So what is important? I think the importance is figuring out somehow where Jews had an impact, or what had an impact on Jews, what became very visible, or what changed the course of things, how people viewed things. And of course, as everyone here knows, this is a choice you make every single sentence when you're writing history. You always are deciding what's important here, what seems important, because it emerges from the sources you're reading, what influence people's lives.
And the numbers in New York make it completely different from the other cities. And I think that also goes along with what Danny was saying about politics, that the politics or Jewish style of politics really takes off only after you have not only the politicians, but you have the people and the culture to support these politicians. And you're able to do that in part due to the concentration in the neighborhood. So the space of the city and the the continued desire of immigrant Jews and then their children to live together and then be forming new spaces. And then even when you move to Brooklyn, you're moving to an area where other Jews are, where the Jewish builders have built the areas, that the demographics and the numbers and the neighborhoods come together. And the way that I wanted it to work was to try to then experience what it would be like to walk down these blocks and see these different buildings, and then the type of how these buildings represented everyday life and also showed the diversity of that life, so that you're walking in a neighborhood just a few blocks and you see the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which could be a symbol of Orthodox Judaism. A block later, Senator Yarmolowski's bank, a symbol of capitalism, and then a block later, the Forward building, a symbol of socialism, that had to be built taller than Yarmolowski's bank as part of a competition. And you really then see, then to make that even more complicated, in the Forward newspaper, ads for Yarmolowski's bank opening, appealing to the working class to come. So that kind of concentration of people, the space, the way that the geography of New York and how concentrated it was, and the neighborhoods that bring these diverse experiences together. And that, more than kind of following any strand or saying one strand is more important than the other, but seeing how they're all interacting together is what was, I think, important.
Yeah, of course, everything is always the same and everything is always different from everything else. And a lot of our story is the story of Jewish encounter with modernity, which was the same things were going on in Europe and in other points of immigration. But I think there was something different about New York. I think the sheer size of the community had something to do with it, and also the fact that this was. The city grew so much. It was really kind of a new city in the 19th century in a lot of ways, and that New York to this day, the establishment is usually made up of the last layer of immigrants, and so this, I think, opens up space for each group to come in and make their imprint in very big ways, and I think that was the case with the Jews as well.
In terms of what impact, in terms of historians, I'll take it to art historians. And if you take the big survey books as an example, all of the survey books on American art, none of them have a Jewish object, a Jewish image. Maybe in one, there's the obligatory Ben Shahn, Sacco, and Vanzetti. They usually will bypass Philip Guston, Rothko, Lee Krasner, who should be there, and they'll go right to Jackson Pollock. So, and they might have an Ashcan school image of Jews on the Lower East Side, but not by a Jewish artist. So, there's no real go-to source or representation. There's no equivalent of what we put together. So if even one of these images shows up in the next printing of Frances Pohl's Social History of American Art, and she's a neighbor of mine, so I'm going to be like, do this. I'd be thrilled. But so this is not in the hands of art historians. This is not in the hands of historians of American art, and it should be, because we're working so hard to diversify how we define and how we represent American art, and Jewish artists and representation of Jews and visual culture has not gotten in there at all.
I would like to keep the discussion going from my work and from others' work on the question of Jewish persistence in neighborhoods, their continuing love affair with cities, their propensity to leave first or leave last from urban neighborhoods. And again, to repeat what I said before, such a complex story. And let me just note one thing that I've mentioned already, and that is, you look at the history of suburbanization after World War II. Suburban locales are built, white people move out, Jewish people in the lead, perhaps, maybe true of other cities. The New York story is very complex. We have a semi-suburban locale to move to, if we want. It's called Queens, which was underpopulated by Jews, but it's part of a migration within the city. You have Jews who are moving to suburbia and then move back into the city because they miss New York. They miss the theater, they miss the opera, they miss the beloved Yankees, and they come back into the city. I heard some hissing in the audience. that person can now leave the auditorium.
Jeff, it's a very complex,
but
you said it yourself, it's a very complex story, so you have to...
Complex stories. But it's sort of interesting, you had a panel on sports. You say sports, everybody laughs, but it's a very serious context. In any event, to what extent do Jews stay in the city longer than others? Do they feel comfortable, less comfortable, more comfortable than other people? I'm thinking of a wonderful book on the history of Canarsie, which talks about Jews and Italians, to what extent they engage what people might call the urban crisis of a certain time period. So that is a theme which I'm not ending through my book, but I'm reopening it. I hope I'm nuancing it somewhat. And again, just to repeat myself, complexity and nuance and diversity are the hallmark of the New York Jewish experience.
So one of the points that has not been mentioned that I think of as really crucial to New York, and I think it has an impact on the city's spaces, although I wouldn't go so far as to theorize that, is that you have in New York a city that lacks a majority population. And that happens very early in its history. So with no majority population, the dynamics of the relationships among the different groups, you think of how the groups get sliced along religious lines and their diversity, they get sliced along immigrant ethnic lines and their diversity, they get sliced yet again along racial lines and their diversities. All of this helps to create a rather different dynamic, and those things get played out in the physical spaces of New York. It gets played out in the ways in which New Yorkers represent themselves and are represented. This is one of the most diverse cities in the United States and has been so for well over a century, for close to 2 centuries. And that has required other Americans to come to terms with what New York, as the nation's cultural center and financial center, and for many years a commercial center, also is its most diverse center, has really required others out there, other Americans, to sort of come to terms with what New York is. And Jews play, are a critical piece of this mix in so many different ways. And I think that the 3 volumes here, they really do get to what that complexity is. I know there's no, as it were, simple story. They have different organizing themes, as do the essays, but if you come away from reading the books with a sense of questions and a desire for more, then indeed I think we've accomplished what we wanted to do. So I just want to thank our panelists again for participating. There were a lot of people whose work went into making this project, and come September, it should be very exciting to actually have an opportunity to read it. So thank you all very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.